ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector grid.
The filming of a lunar module ascent stage floating off a lunar surface on December 14th, 1972, not only marked the end of the Apollo program, but also an end to the era of manned deep space flight. There are three reasons you will often hear cited for the cancellation of Apollo. The first is public opinion.
You know, when Apollo 17 landed on the moon, people were calling up the networks and bitching because reruns of I Love Lucy were canceled. Reruns, for Christ's sake. I can understand if it was a new Lucy show. I mean, what the hell is a walk on the moon? But reruns. Oh, jeez.
Though it has been suggested the film was responsible for the myth, Lucy's shows were airing the same day that Apollo 17 landed, and not everyone was interested in watching a repeat of Apollo 11 for the 5th time. The second reason for the cancellation was Apollo 13, the 1970 lunar landing that was itself cancelled 2 days into the mission. Rumour has it that then President Nixon was so emotionally taken with events, he wanted the remaining missions cancelled for fear of losing 3 astronauts. However, both explanations can be discounted because NASA actually cancelled Apollo 20 in January 1970, 3 months before the ill-fated Apollo 13 mission had lifted off and well before the public had grown weary of yet another moon landing. The reason was budget cuts, or so we have been led to believe, because by that stage at least 3 Saturn V rockets, complete with Apollo command and service modules, had been built and paid for, and there were plenty of trained astronauts on hand to crew them on trips to the moon. How do we know? Because Skylab was nothing more than a Saturn V third stage S4B kitted out as a makeshift space station. The rocket that launched it was a Saturn V, and the 3 crews that visited it before the end of 1974, all of whom had been on or were trained for Apollo lunar missions, did so in Apollo command and service modules launched atop Saturn 1B rockets. And it still cost $2.5 billion, which was more than 5 times the cost of Apollo 17. So no, Apollo didn't stop for financial reasons either. It was just reworked. What had to stop was going to the moon, or at least pretending to. To understand why, we need look no further than the true nature of every Apollo mission. As explained in previous videos, only the S4B and lunar descent stage went to the moon, while the command module and lunar ascent stage remained within the safety of a low Earth orbit, as demonstrated during the Apollo 7 and Apollo 9 manned missions, so the astronauts were never that far from home. Next, we turn to the US National Intelligence estimates of the Soviet space program. These declassified secret documents state, year in, year out, that the CIA did not believe the Soviets capable of competing with Apollo when it came to landing a man on the moon, or that they were in a race to get there first. They were instead concentrating their efforts towards long-duration orbital space stations that would allow them to observe what the rest of the world was up to. Which they most certainly would have when it came to NASA, whose manned spacecraft were never any closer to the moon than those of the Russians. It was only the failure of the first 2 Salyut space stations that afforded NASA a window of opportunity to launch Apollos 15, 16 and 17 unobserved. But the prospect of a permanent Russian presence in low Earth orbit after 1972 put an end to any ideas NASA might have had for running their moon landing scam in the future, and they returned to where they had left off 6 years earlier, limiting the scope of their human exploration to within the safety of the thermosphere, as had the Russians, and not once venturing into or beyond the Van Allen radiation belts unless by unmanned robotic spacecraft. Though it remains to be seen whether or not the manned Artemis mission into a high Earth orbit, followed by a trip around the moon, will take place as scheduled, proving once and for all it is possible, one thing is for sure. During the Apollo 11 mission, when NASA claimed the spaceship was close to the moon and travelling at 3,000 miles per hour, Neil Armstrong said something that proves beyond doubt he was watching a live TV broadcast from Earth, which would not have been possible unless Apollo 11 was in a low and stationary position above the planet.